Thank you so much, Akila. Awesome. So I really didn't need any of that. Everyone mostly knows me, so that's good. But thank you, Akila, so much. So I'm glad everyone's here, taking time out of the first beautiful day of the year and wasting another 15 minutes to get started. So I'll be talking about some work that I have done the last year. If you're you're an audience member of the second year talks last year, I had proposed this work, and then it's all been done, and so now I can present the findings. So the talk's called Questionable Research Practices and the Emergence of a Stigmatized Academic Class. And it wasn't my creativity that came up with this excellent title. It's actually a reference to a Jennifer Stuber paper. Does this not laser onto the thing? Oh, it doesn't. So it's a reference to a Jennifer Stuber paper that came out in 2008. So all of the creativity of this title goes to her. Okay, so there's three things I want to talk about today. The first, I just want to talk briefly about the current replication crisis in psychology, which acts as kind of like the nucleator that kind of kicked off all this work. I'm then going to go more in detail in estimating the number of psychologists who use questionable research practices, so how big is the population of users. And then finally, I'm going to talk about evaluating the stigmatization of those questionable research practice users. Okay, so let's start with the replication crisis. So I'm sure most people know, but since around 2010, 2011, there's been this increasing concern that papers that are being published are not externally valid, that they're not being replicated. A lot of credit goes to Daryl Bem's paper from 2011, where he showed over 9 experiments that were very high-powered, that extrasensory perception exists. That's not been replicated. A famous one is the Dana Carney, Amy Cuddy, and Andy Yap paper on power posing that over time has not replicated. Grit and ego depletion are kind of on the chopping block now. There's eroding evidence that these are at least as strong as people have claimed them to be. And recently, if you've been following the Brian Wansink debacle over at Cornell, plenty of papers that he and his students have published have wound up being either having errata published on them or being retracted, which is concerning, right, as a field. And so as a psychologist, I'm interested in the behavior that may be leading to these issues, right? And the term that's been coined for these behaviors is questionable research practices. In the literature, these have been defined as 10 different behaviors that a scientist can do either in data collection or in data analysis or in manuscript preparation that may lead to an increase in false positives, right? So an increase in saying that there's an effect or saying there's a finding when there actually isn't one. So things that scientists can do during data collection, deciding to collect more data after looking at the analysis and finding it not significant, and then collecting data piecemeal afterwards until they find some significant finding. The opposite of that, stopping data collection earlier because you already found something significant, so not running all your participants, and also looking to see whether excluding data will have an effect on your outcome without any sort of a priori reason for doing so. And then in papers that are published, right, so in manuscript preparation, there are different behaviors that can be considered questionable, not reporting all of the study's dependent measures, rounding off p-values to reach significance, fabricating data is usually the most severe one considered, claiming that results are unaffected by demographic variables when that's actually not checked or they're unsure. So these are 10 behaviors, but they're not the only 10 that can be considered questionable. Vickerts in 2016 wrote this big long paper about researcher degrees of freedom, that's what this is, and says things ranging from failing to specify the sampling plan, failing to randomly assign participants. This list goes on and on and on. So it's not just the only 10 that I just mentioned, the 10 that I'll be using in the studies that I'll be presenting, but there could be many other places where questionable behaviors may exist in the scientific process that may lead to these false positive findings. So there's been lots of interventions that have been proposed already. Things like pre-registration, so time-stamping your method plan and your analysis plan. Things like registered reports, so having a peer review of your methods and having that ready for publication before you collect data. Things like preprints, so instead of just having 3 reviewers, releasing your article to kind of the wider audience to get more critique of your work. Having signed reviews so that reviewers aren't hiding behind anonymity when they make comments on your work. and also having open data so that people can then re-review your analyses. These are all things that have been proposed, things that people are doing to different extents. But I think that these are all interventions that are still kind of out there missing a sized problem, right? My wife's a management consultant, and I pulled from that area this great quote: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? If you don't have eyes on the scope of the problem, then it's really hard to manage that problem, right? So I feel like all the previous interventions are all out there, all things that are good. Those are all good things. But will they actually manage the use of questionable research practices? It's hard to say so far. So that brings us into the next part, estimating the number of users of questionable research practices. So I'm not the first person to think of doing that, right? People have tried this already. The first one that really kind of hits the radar is this Leslie John paper from 2011 or 2012, where they asked if people used questionable research practices, and they found, it might be hard to read, I'm sorry, they found very high levels, right? So 63% of respondents claim that they had failed to report all the study's dependent measures, 63%. And that's high for other QRPs as well. These are the 10 QRPs that I mentioned earlier. That got some pushback from Fiedler and Schwartz in 2016, who said, maybe the questions you're asking are really hard to say no to. Maybe they're so vague that anyone would say yes, that this has happened. And so when they redid this study, they changed the wording of the questions a little bit and found prevalence to be very low, less than 10% for any QRP. Okay, and then last year, a replication of the first paper, of the Leslie John paper, came out of an Italian cohort, and they found similar high levels of QRP use. So it's kind of gone back and forth. These papers have two shared issues. The first one is that they're all direct estimate. They're all researchers asking other researchers if they've done a certain behavior or not. The other is that they look at QRP use across all time, across their whole career, versus recently. If we're interested in the issue of questionable research practices as it pertains to the current replication crisis, it's important to know if the behavior is happening now and not in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So it's interesting work, it just may not be pertinent to the current replication crisis. Yes?
Did things used to replicate?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think people are very focused on things now. I don't know how previous findings replicate.
That's hard to know, given how the Rutgers journals were published replications for a very long time. And some of the first replication crisis was cognitive dissonance, where the law eventually became ask Leon, because sometimes you get it, sometimes you wouldn't, what determines it, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So our record is deeply mired in thought.
Yeah, and my instinct would be that it's not like there was this, pristine record of findings up until 2010, and then all of a sudden things went to crap, But I don't know if there's work on that and how replicable those are compared to kind of the ones in question now. So the current study tries to address these two issues that these previous estimates have. So we're going to do a direct estimate, or I've already done it. So I'll show you it. So I did a direct estimate because I wanted to kind of compare, right? I used the unmatched count technique. So this is an indirect method of measuring prevalence of things. So it's not quite direct, it's more indirect. And then I'll be doing the generalized network scale-up method, which is a social network approach to measuring this, which I'll go into a lot of detail describing. And I'll also look at QRP use only in the last 12 months. And by last 12 months, that's a time frame of October 2016 to December 2017. It took about 3 months to run the study. And so when the question respondents are answering that, that can range about 15 months. So this last 12 months is the time frame of end of 2016 through all of 2017. Okay, so let's talk about these three estimators. The first one's the direct estimate. It's pretty straightforward. Participants are asked the question, did you use a questionable research practice in the last 12 months, or did this not happen? The definition of questionable research practices is given to them all the time, and it's the definition that I gave before, those 10 behaviors, either in a manuscript published in the last 12 months or a behavior during analysis or collection that's happened in the past 12 months. And that's described just by this equation, C over N. I know, Lee, you don't like the equations, but it's okay. I have to put it in. Okay, so that's just the number of people who say, yes, I've used a questionable research practice in the past 12 months, divided by the number of people who got the question. Okay, the unmatched count technique. The way this works is that respondents are randomly assigned into one of two conditions, either an innocuous list condition or a stigma list condition. And it's called stigma list historically, and we'll talk about if this is actually a stigma a little bit later on. So here are two lists. This one is the innocuous list. It contains 9 items that are innocuous. I own a dog, I'm a vegetarian, I go to the gym a lot, things like that. This is the stigma list. It contains all the same items as the innocuous list except for a 10th item, which contains the stigma item. So I've used a questionable research practice in the last 12 months. And so the way this works is that a participant's given this list, and they're asked to identify just the number of items that correspond to them. Not which items, but just how many items correspond to them. So if I own a dog and I can drive a motorcycle and that's it, I would respond with the number 2. 2 items correspond to me. So the way this is calculated is just the mean difference between the stigma list and the innocuous list, and that generates the proportion of people that identify with the stigma item. This has been used recently in a really great paper written by Will Gervais called How Many Atheists Are There?, where they used this compared to a self-report, and they found increases usually in almost all groups, not Republicans. Republicans went down. Okay, and the last estimator is the generalized network scale-up estimator, and I want to break it down into 2 parts. First, I want to talk about the network scale-up part, and then I want to talk about the generalized part. So, network scale-up. It's defined by this equation, where this is the number of people known in a hidden population by person yi over the total number of people known, period. So what this does is I ask, or whoever's doing it, asks a bunch of questions to get at the total social network size of that participant to estimate D. And then they're asked how many people they know in a hidden population. In this question, it's how many psychologists do you know that have used at least one questionable research practice in the past 12 months? We use this list of 24 names that vary in commonality across all psychologists to determine D. But how do you know someone, right? Know needs to be defined, and know is defined. It was defined in this kind of hallmark paper in '98. There's 3 facets to knowing. So first, you need to know them, and they need to know you. The relationship needs to be reciprocal. So I know Donald Trump, but Donald Trump doesn't know me, so that would not be reciprocal. You can contact them if you wanted to by any means, so email, phone. You could walk up to their office and say hi. You could walk down the street and see them if you wanted to. And you had to have been in contact in the last 2 years. So if you satisfy all 3 of these conditions, you know that person. So let's do an example. So after measuring a bunch of known populations, I determined that you know 200 people total. That's your D. And then I ask you, how many people do you know who smoke? And you say, I know 2 people who smoke. So by using that equation, 2 over 200, just based on an n of 1, which is awful, but we can estimate that 2 over 200, 1% of the population smokes. And so the way that you scale this up, the scale-up part, is by doing this over many, many people and then adding up all of these fractions. Okay, but that has 2 big assumptions. Excuse me. So 2 big assumptions in the network scale-up estimator. The first is that the population size of the general population of psychologists is the same size as the hidden population social network. So assuming that people who use QRPs or people who smoke know the same number of people as the general population, right? That's a big assumption. The second assumption, which is even worse, is that you know everything about everyone in your social network. So if I ask you, how many people do you know who smoke, you know the smoking status of every single person in your social network, which is not a very good assumption, right? There's a lot of things that people can conceal that then you might not know about them. So the generalized part of the generalized network scale-up estimator gets rid of these 2 assumptions. We can make estimates about both the relationship of social network sizes between our 2 networks and the transmission of potentially concealable information. So here's the equation for that. This is the part that you've already seen, right? So the sum of y, the number of people known in a hidden population, over the total number of people known. And we add in this second part to generalize the equation. So tau is the transmission rate. How much does that information about the identity transmit through the social network? And delta, the popularity ratio, how similar or different are these 2 social network sizes? So the popularity ratio is a little more straightforward to calculate. You find the average network size of the target population. So in this case, it's QRP users, could be smokers. and you divide that by the average network size of the general population. So if it's less than 1, this group has a smaller average social network size. If it's larger than 1, this group has a higher average social network size. Next comes the doozy. Transmission rate is a little bit more complicated. So this is an ego network. An ego network is centered on our participant, so a single person, and every person that they know is called an alter, right? So Mary, who is our ego, has 4 alters: John, Sally, Mike, and Ann. Now, Mary smokes. Mary is a member of the hidden population. And we want to know how information about this smoking identity travels between her and her alters. So there's 4 ways information can exist inside this ego network. The first is mutual transmission, right? Mary knows that Sally smokes, and Sally knows that Mary smokes. The information about that identity information goes back and forth. The opposite of that is no transmission at all. Smoking status is unknown for Sally and for Mary. Mary doesn't know if Sally smokes. Sally doesn't know that Mary does in fact smoke. The other 2 are directional transmissions. That's really hard to read, I'm sorry. So here, Mary doesn't know if Sally smokes, but Sally knows that Mary smokes, so it's a unidirectional transmission of information. And this is the opposite. Mary knows that Sally smokes, and Sally doesn't know that Mary smokes. So these are the 4 ways information about identity can exist inside this ego network. So what we ask participants to do, we give them a card, and we did it digitally. We gave them a digital card for them to take each person in their ego network and put them on this game board where they exist in terms of the transmission of identity information. So in this case, John, well, Mary knows that John smokes, and John knows that Mary smokes. The information transmission is mutual. For Sally, there's no transmission, so unknown if Sally smokes, and Sally does not know if Mary smokes. And we can do that for all participants, or all alters of participants. And we can generate tau, which is the transmission rate, which is the sum of people, the sum of alters generated that know Mary's smoking identity, divided by the total number of alters generated. So in this case, it's 2/4, or tau of 0.5. Is that clear? OK. So to recap, I'll be showing you 3 estimates. A direct estimate, where we ask them directly if they've used QRPs or not in the past 12 months, an unmatched count technique estimate, an indirect method of measuring, and the generalized social network scale-up to generate an estimate of the size of users of questionable research practices. So the way that we did that, we had 3 surveys that were sent out simultaneously. Everyone was randomized into one of 3 survey conditions. The first survey included the unmatched count control. This was the innocuous list. Participants were then given a question to ask their total network size. So we asked them with all these different names. We then asked them how many QRP users do they know. And then we asked them a final bit about stigma, which I'll get to in the second half. The second survey contained the stigma list. So this was the 10-item unmatched count list. We then also estimated their D, their social network size, and asked them how many QRP users they knew. And the third survey, which was a little bit different, first we asked them about D, their social network size. We then asked them directly if they've used a QRP or not. And then if they did, they went into this game of contacts to measure the transmission rate with the cards in the box. Yes?
Can I just ask about where you got those names? Did you look at lists of psychologists? Where were they originally, are they specific to psychology?
Yes.
Where were they originally generated?
Yeah, so Leslie John, I reached out to Leslie John, who did the first paper, and I said, where did you get all the psychologists? And she said, well, we went through all the departments that grant PhDs, and we took all their information. Do you want this list? I said, sure. So I got the list, and then we updated it at the end of 2017 to generate a list of all psychologists at PhD granting American universities. From there, we then generated the frequency of every first name, and then from there, we pulled common, uncommon, and rare, which we just, not median split, but we, did thirds. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they're specific to psychology. I think 2.1% of all psychologists are named David. So there's a little fact for trivia night. Think about all those Davids you know. So, and this is just some descriptives about that. So we sent half of all the 7,101 psychologists survey 3. And the reason we did this was because I wanted to make sure we got people who used QRPs answering in the affirmative that then we can estimate tau. So we didn't know what size of number that would be, so we wanted to go as big as possible to try and get enough people to do the game of contacts with. So 3,551 solicitation emails were sent that used survey 3. The rest were split between surveys 1 and 2, about a 3% bounce rate, 130 respondents, full respondents. So I'm only going to show data for full respondents. 130 from survey 1, 149 from survey 2, 308 from survey 3. So about overall 9% full response rate across the 3. Yes?
Can I just ask about how it was described to them? Like, did they know they were going to do a survey about questionable research practice? Like, how is this pitched?
Yeah, so it was pitched with mild deception, as the IRB would call it. So the email that was sent, oh, and you were all participants, so you may have seen this email back at the end of the year if you're tenured or tenure track. So the email was pitched as asking about people you know and your colleagues, people you know at work and people you know. And then at the end, at the very end, there was a secondary debrief that said we're looking at the size of questionable research practices, which is why we're only looking at full responses, people who were then debriefed and said, yes, you can use my data for that. So it was pitched mildly. The email that was pitched didn't mention questionable research practices, just about people you know.
Do you have a sense of how many people dropped out at that point? Like, we're like, oh, never mind.
I can have a sense of the number of people who have opened it, but not who have seen it and then didn't click at least or go to the survey. So I don't know.
Yeah, my other question is just, are you worried about self-selection with,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I mean, who is answering it?
Yes.
Going through the whole thing?
Oh, yeah, no, yeah. It's a huge issue, which is why there's no generalizing to the larger psychological population, because non-responders all share non-response in common, right? So here I have respondents, and the responders are going to say certain things. It's very likely that the people who use questionable research practices and decided to partake are ones who are more easily communicating their QRP identity. And so their direct estimate may be, it may skew the estimate lower because there may be more people who use questionable research practices who concealed by just not participating. Yeah, so that's definitely an issue, and there'll be no generalization to the whole community. It's more population-based based on who responded. Yeah.
So wait, let me ask you that.
Yeah.
So your best, is this your right interpretation? Because this is kind of what I heard you say, is that your best guess, you don't really know, but your best guess would be that your estimates are going to underestimate usage because of selection in is more likely to be biased to people against, people who use it would be less likely to
Yes.
buy into doing it.
Yes, so these should be conservative estimates for that reason, right? If someone is more willing to out themselves and their identity, that is more likely to come through by people who participate versus people who say, this is an identity I have and I conceal this identity. I don't know what this survey is going to do. I'm not going to participate.
But the survey's anonymous, right?
Yes,
There's no way for you to track their identity.
that's correct.
That's been made clear to them.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so in that solicitation, it was. It's completely anonymous. It's completely de-identified. That's all in the solicitation.
Well, I mean, and literally today, who knows what's anonymous, but at least that's how it's written.
Yes. I don't have any information that, I don't have it. Qualtrics might have it. I don't have any information that can tie participants to any sort of identity information.
Well, Admin probably has it too, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, Facebook might have it. Who knows? Okay, and so just some short descriptives about demographics of the group of respondents. So the male-female split was pretty even. It was about 20 more females than males. More full professors responded than assistant and associate professors. And it skewed highly liberal, which I put in for Nate. Yes.
Not social psychology.
This is all of psychology.
All of psychology.
This is all of psychology.
Did you have this to the demographics in the field? Did you have those data? Are those data available?
I can get some of that from our census of the population, right? I can get male-female from our census of participants. I haven't looked at either tenure level or ideology and compared this to that, no.
I thought Lee's question was whether the social psychologist clinicians.
This is all of them. This is.
Well, I'm going to say, but can you break it down?
Oh.
Who answered most?
I haven't looked at that breakdown, no.
But you have that.
Some of it I have and some of it I can get.
One of the reasons I ask is
Yeah.
it's not definitive, but it would help give some sense of how much your symbol
Represents.
skewed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't completely solve the willingness to discuss problem matter.
Yeah.
If there are huge disconnects between demographics, then it's like, okay, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if it tracks pretty closely, at least you have that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that I haven't looked at, but that makes a lot of sense, yeah. If this skews more male than the whole population, then that's going to say something different than if it was more representative of what the true underlying population is. Yeah, I haven't looked at that, but that's something that could be done, yes. Okay, so now let's look at the estimates. So for the direct estimate, we had 308, this is for people who took survey 3, 308 participants who saw the direct estimate question, 58 people identified as using at least one QRP in the last 12 months, which gives us an estimate of 18.18%. So this is saying 18.18% of total of all American associated, PhD granting American universities, 18.18% of them have used a QRP in the last 12 months. And this will come up again, I'll summarize it again.
I have a question about the international data.
Yes, yes.
Do you know that all of them have conducted research in the last year?
No, I don't have that.
So the 80s, whatever, the 81.82%.
18. Oh, the other ones. Yes, the other ones. The other ones. Yeah, yeah.
The ones who are saying, no, I've never done it,
Yeah.
are potentially a mix of people who have done research and saying they don't do it or haven't done it, and people who have done no research in that time.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. I didn't realize that when I saw the data.
Yeah, yeah, so that's right. So that group, this group, yeah, the other side of this includes people who have done research, who have not used QRPs, and people who have not used QRPs because they haven't used any research practices at all, yes. The second estimate, the unmatched count, so the average number of items that corresponded to people in the stimulus condition was 4.38. The average in the inoculus condition was 4.28. So we take the difference of these two means, and we get a prevalence estimate of 10.46, which is lower than the direct estimate, which is puzzling. And I have some reasons to believe that this is not a very credible estimate, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the many weaknesses that exist with all of this. But 10.46, okay. And now the generalized network scale-up I want to take in 3 parts. So the first one I'll talk about delta, the popularity ratio. The second one I'll talk about tau, the transmission rate, and then I'll put it all together into a final estimate. Okay, so delta. Do QRP users have a different sized social network than the general population of psychologists? So these are just density plots of those distribution of social network sizes. The average social network size for the QRP users was 178.6, and the average social network size of the general population of psychologists was 184. And so when we calculate delta, we get 0.96. So they're very, very similar. And you would expect that to an extent, since having social networks that you can collaborate with, that you can work with in our profession, you would expect that these would be similar, and they are similar. So that's our first piece of the equation, delta, right there, 0.96. So tau, the transmission rate, so these numbers in these boxes correspond to the number of alters that were generated by our QRP users for each of the 4 conditions that the information can exist within their network. So we see that for people who use questionable research practices, they've identified 58 alters, all cumulatively, where the information travels back and forth. That alter uses a QRP, and I've used a QRP. So we can calculate tau from this, and tau is 0.06, which is very, very low. The 6% transmission of QRP identity to peers, which means that for every 1 QRP user that you know, there are another 15 researchers that you know who have also used QRPs but concealed that identity information from you. So 0.06 is tau. So this is potential evidence of selective disclosure, which I'll talk about in the stigma half. And so that's tau. So we have 0.06 here, 0.96 here, and then we can put the whole thing together. So here's our equation, y, which is the total number of people who have used QRPs known by the general population, 664, and the sum of all social network sizes of the general population is 46,827. We have delta, we have tau. We don't need n for this equation, but gives us an estimate of 24.47%. OK, so here are the three put together. Our unmatched count estimate gave us 10.46. These confidence intervals, they're 95% confidence intervals, but they need to be bootstrapped. So these are subject to change. I think they will change. The direct estimates, and we just asked people directly, we estimated 18.18%. And the generalized network scale-up estimator gave us an estimate of 24.47. OK, so the next thing I think it should be a question on everyone's mind is, how accurate is the network scale-up estimate? Is this something that people just wildly guess, or is it something that we can actually use to generate accurate estimates? So the good thing about this technique is that built into it are 24 populations of known size, right? When we ask about those 24 different names, those are subpopulations of psychologists that we know the size of. Like I said, there's 2-point-something% of Davids. We know that that's size of people. So when we ask them to estimate these sizes, we can compare them to the actual prevalence of those people. And what we get is something pretty reasonable, right? So this line is that if there's 0.5, it's 0.5. So it's pretty reasonable. There's a phenomenon where people tend to overestimate small groups and underestimate large groups, which we do see. So here's David. David's out here, and they think this population's smaller. But we have Marks and Allens and Janets, and they all fall pretty close. Reasonable, I would say. So I think this makes us feel reasonable about the generalized network scale-up estimate of 24.47. But like I said, there are lots of limitations, right? So 2 out of 3 of the estimates are self-reports, right? The unmatched count technique, while it's indirect, it's still a self-report. If I really want to conceal my identity, I can just not include that one item on the list in my total number of items that correspond to me. And the direct estimate has a similar problem. Also, a very low response rate, right? And there are plenty of reasons for this to be the case. Psychologists are a hard population to study. They're also often solicited for studies. There were absolutely no incentives to participate, not at all. There was not one, not even tchotchkes, which I wanted to do. Like don't you do those little Rutgers tchotchkes? I wanted to do something like that, but I can't. Maybe later. Participants only had a week to finish it once they started. This was to help minimize contamination of the subject pool, as these were done in the 3 months. It took 10 waves to do. So in total, we had 587 participants out of the whole group of 7,101 American PhD-associated psychologists who were all solicited, right? So all the people who aren't in those 587 are non-responders. So the final problem is defining questionable research practices, right? I used the 10 that were previously used in the literature, but Vickerts and a million other people have said, well, there's a whole bunch of ways to define questionable research practices, and there's plenty of times when a questionable research practice is fine, right? That's the definition of questionable. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, oftentimes it's gray. So defining what a questionable research practice is can be kind of a moving target. But there's also a lot of strengths, too. So this is the first attempt to use social network estimates to size this population, which I think is a big strength. It's the first time the game of contacts, which is the method to measure transmission rate, has been done digitally. Usually they do it in person, so this was the first time to do it. So we've pre-registered a study to do a measure of equality between digital and in-person to see if it actually corresponds to in-person use of game of contacts. And as I showed, the participants are pretty good at estimating populations of known size, which increases our confidence that the social network of estimate of QRP prevalence is in the right place. So the take-home message from this part is that there is a number of psychologists who are currently using questionable research practices. So 18.18% corresponds to 1,291 psychologists. And the 24.47 is 1,737 psychologists. So there are a number of people who are using questionable research practices, even in the face of the 7 or 8 years of talk about this. But the question is, are these psychologists stigmatized? So that brings me to the third part of this talk. And how am I doing on time, by the way? OK, I think I'm doing OK. So just a refresher course, a one-slide refresher on stigma. Goffman describes it as a mark that devalues an individual in the eyes of society. This can be physical or not physical. It may encourage individuals to conceal an identity that may devalue them if that identity is concealable. It's important for the development of interventions, right? Knowing how a person responds to how society views them is important to develop something to either alleviate or encourage stigma, which I'll talk about. And the cool thing about the social network method that I described is that there are two directly observable behaviors that are associated with stigma that we can see in this method. And that's social withdrawal and selective disclosure. So what are those? So selective disclosure, it's a stigma-reducing behavior. It's when you disclose your stigma identity to those who are seen as trustworthy. So this is either in-group members, so people who share that stigmatized identity with you, or others seen as trustworthy. And this is a way to kind of reduce the cognitive dissonance that exists between of being one identity and portraying another in the kind of social stage. So the social withdrawal is another stigma-reducing behavior, which involves avoiding contact with others to limit stigmatizing attitudes or behaviors. So kind of saying, well, the probability of being outed of my stigmatized identity at any moment is so-and-so. Then I should reduce the number of people I see to reduce that probability. But this may be detrimental to mental health as you're cutting off social ties. Okay. So there's a few theoretical domains I want to talk about as it relates to the stigma work I'll show. So the first is attribution. So a lot of this is based off of Lincoln Phelan's work. They state that the way a person comes to be stigmatized may depend on how that stigmatized identity was developed. Either they were born with it, or it was something that they do. The attribution of that may change how they're stigmatized by the social group at large. If an individual is seen as threatening or induces fear in the general population, that may be a cause of stigmatization. Lincoln Phelan described people who are stigmatized need to be in a position of lower power than the stigmatizers. So that's something that we'll look at with QRP users. And people who violate social norms, right? If you violate social norms, this tends to put you in a position to be stigmatized against. So 130 people received this additional stigma questionnaire. This is at the end of a first survey. So 130 people. The questions were adapted from both Jennifer Stuber and Link's work on smoking stigma. They were scored on a 1 to 4 scale between strongly disagree and strongly agree. That were then collapsed into agree or disagree. And now I get to present to you the much maligned pie charts. I like them, so it's okay. I'll stand with them. No, it's the whole, everyone I talk to, they go, pie charts. Use a stacked bar chart. I'm like, that's a pie chart. Well, someone said, use a stacked bar chart. And I said, a stacked bar chart is just a rectangular pie chart. So. But that's okay. We'll get through it. I'll get through it. Okay. Okay, we'll get through it. Here are the pie charts. Okay, so attribution. So these are the questions that participants saw, and this is how they agreed or disagreed with each. So most researchers believe using QRPs is a sign of professional failure. Kind of split on that one. 44% say yes, QRP use is a sign of professional failure, while others don't. When we looked at internal source of this stigma identity, is QRP use due to weak character? Most people said no. And when we say, is QRP use due to stress? Most people said yes. So participants here are identifying QRP use as a response to some external stimulus, in this case, stress. Okay, then we looked at threat. Are QRP users threatening? Very much so, yes. So when we asked, most researchers would not let a QRP user mentor their students. Most people agreed with that. As well as QRP users are a threat to their own students, yes. So to kind of the next generation upcoming psychologists, QRP users are a threat to those people. And then we looked at power. We didn't ask questions about power, but we got asked other questions about power, but not directly. So we looked at the income of the general population and QRP users. So Lincoln Phelan described economic difference as being one source of lower power. And QRP users do, on average, annually make $6,300 less than the general population of psychologists. And maybe that's because they're lower tenure. So we looked at that too. Tenure was dummy-coded 1 to 3, assistant, associate, and full professor. The general population averaged 2.19 on this dummy-coded scale, whereas QRP users averaged 1.9. So they tended to be of lower tenure status, lower seniority, and also making less money. So by these two measures, they tend to be in a position of lower power compared to the general population of psychologists. When we asked how most people felt about QRP use, to kind of get a feel of social norms, 75% said that using QRPs, most colleagues would find it unacceptable. So questionable research practice use as a violation of social norms. Interestingly, 8.6% of people said it would be acceptable. So, okay, so to summarize, psychologists and the general population see QRP users as responding poorly to external factors, in this case stress. Psychologists see QRP users as a threat to students. QRP users have less economic power and less seniority, and the QRP users violate social norms, which I think is summarized nicely by this last question that we asked. Most researchers think less of those who use QRPs. A vast majority of people agreed with that. So they are seen as less. These questions, this wasn't the last question asked. All the questions were randomly asked, but this is the last one I'm showing, I guess is what I'm saying. Okay, so that's how the general population is feeling towards questionable research practice users. How are they responding? Are they responding is a question. So we can look at social withdrawal. So we can see, are their networks smaller than the general population? And we talked about this already. On the whole, they're not, right? So are QRP users distancing themselves from social interactions, at least among their peers in the research groups? No, doesn't seem that way. You've already seen this slide, so okay. This is the really cool part, I think. So here's the data from tau, right, when we measured transmission rate. And the way this game is set up is that we can actually look at is there selective transmission? Not just is there transmission among alters, are you transmitting to certain alters over others? So if we just split this out a little bit, we can consider this group in-group members. So if the ego, Mary, the smoker, knows that the alter has used a QRP, then that would be an in-group member. This person shares the stigmatized identity with me. I identify this person as like in that stigmatized identity. Here, if the ego doesn't know the alter used QRP or is a member of that stigmatized group, this person is an out-group member, right? Unsure if I share identity information with them. Does that make sense? So the ego is a QRP user, just like Mary the smoker. If the alter is also a QRP user, they're in-group members. I've identified that this person shares this identity with me. So we can calculate an odds ratio. What is the odds that the alter will know my QRP status given I know their QRP status, given that we're in-group members? So we do that odds ratio and we get 95, which is a very big odds ratio that I was very concerned about, but I checked it multiple times and it seems right. So that means that the alter is 95 times more likely to know the ego's QRP use identity if the alter is also an in-group member. So there's, oh, I didn't put it. This is big evidence for in-group bias of information transmission, selective disclosure, disclosing my QRP status to people who share that status with me. Okay, so to summarize that stigma and response part, the general population members hold negative views of QRP users. They conceal their identity from out-group members and selectively disclose to in-group members. And overall, QRP users are stigmatized or devalued by the general population of psychologists. But is the stigma good or bad? So historically, I think, so I was reading up on this, from the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, stigma has been seen as a problem, right? In that case, it's led to a lot of deaths and a lot of sick people. But with smoking, maybe not the case, right? So Ron Bayer up at Columbia wrote this paper saying, is it true that stigmatization always represents a threat to public health? This is, again, in smoking. Is it always true that it represents a threat? Are there conditions when stigmatization may effectively reduce prevalence of behaviors that are linked to disease and death? Can we use stigma, in other words, to lessen unwanted behaviors? Maybe, right? And I thought this was a really great quote. And I said, Ron Bayer, I wonder what other stuff you've said about this, because that seems interesting. And so I looked back, and he actually wrote the exact same thing word for word in 2006, which some people would consider a questionable research practice, especially since this one was written with Jennifer Stuber, and there was no credit given here. So I think this kind of ties the whole thing up. We got right back to the beginning. Conclusions, okay. There's a subpopulation, and that's what I found last night. I found that last night. I was like, God, Ron Bayer, this sounds interesting. Let's add more. Oh, okay. There's a subpopulation of psychologists currently using questionable research practices. The size of that population contains, if we're using the estimates that seem more likely than the unmatched count, which I haven't talked about, but I'll talk about my reasons for not liking it, 1,291 to 1,737. The social environment is hostile towards these individuals, and QRP users may be responding by concealing their identity to peers who are in the outgroup. I think there's some amazing next steps that could happen in this work. We could look at longitudinal observation and measure QRP prevalence over time. Is that population getting bigger or smaller? Some more kind of qualitative work from Matt Model's group, Model, I think his name is, when people asked, well, what did you think QRP use was like 10 years ago, and what do you think about it now? Just kind of memory tracing. Most people felt that all of these qualities, all these QRPs, falsifying data, claiming results unaffected by demographics, all these things that I mentioned earlier, they have decreased, and kind of more positive behaviors, pre-registration, making data public, have increased. So this is asking people how they feel, but I think we could use these methods to measure over time if the population is actually getting bigger or smaller. It'd be great to determine the beneficial or detrimental effects of stigma on QRP use. So if stigma on QRP users is ramped up or ramped down, do we see a difference in their propensity to use questionable research practices? And then using that, develop interventions that either increase stigma or increase support for those who are being stigmatized. And that's it. So I want to thank everyone in the lab, Lee and Akila, Nate and Rachel, all of our awesome undergrad RAs who helped modernize the list that we started with, Diana, Eddie, and David for being on my quals committee, who gave a lot of important feedback that led into this, Leslie John, who gave us the original list to work off of, and Matt Salganik, who's a big generalized social network guy who sat and helped me figure things out. Thank you. So questions?